There was a special atmosphere in the White House press room. The journalists were seated in the hall, with cameras, laptops, and voice recorders on the tables. Everyone was waiting for the start of the press conference, which was supposed to be one of the most discussed in recent times. Today, Donald Trump's new press secretary, Karoline Leavitt, will appear in front of the cameras for the first time. Young, energetic, and incredibly confident, she was the youngest press secretary in history. But this didn't frighten her. She knew she had earned this post long ago. And today she was going to prove it to the whole country. Before entering the White House, Karoline had a distinguished career in Republican circles. She worked in the Trump administration during his first presidential term, defended conservative values in debates with liberal journalists. She has been a fierce critic of fake news, exposing the media for its bias. Her style was clear and reasoned. She did not allow herself to be confused and always knew how to respond. That's why Trump chose her to be his press secretary. He loved strong, confident people, and Karoline fit his requirements perfectly. But along with this appointment, she had to pass her first serious test. The press conference the whole country was waiting for. When Karoline walked to the podium, the room fell silent. She walked confidently to the center, stood behind the podium, and looked out at the audience. Her direct gaze told everyone present. She knows why she's here. She knows what she's going to say. And she's not going to back down. Karoline adjusted the microphone and said, "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our first press conference. Today we will discuss important topics that concern our country. I am ready to answer your questions." The journalists looked at each other. They understood that this was not just a press secretary. This was a new player in the political war. Neutral journalists were the first to speak out. The first few questions were standard. What are the administration's plans for the coming months? What changes does Trump plan to introduce? What is the White House's position on current international issues? Karoline answered confidently, clearly, and without unnecessary emotion. She had the information and knew how to present it. But she felt that this was just a warm-up. She knew that the main blow was yet to come. And this blow will be delivered by CNN. A hand went up in the hall. Karoline saw who exactly wanted to ask the question: John Raymond, CNN's lead reporter. A man known for his attacks on Trump, a champion of manipulation and creating high-profile scandals. He smiled and spoke. "Ms. Leavitt, you are young, you have little experience in such a high position. Do you really think you are worthy of being the president's press secretary? Or did Trump simply choose you because you are easy to manage?" Muffled laughter could be heard in the hall. But Karoline didn't smile. She looked up, her calmness frightening. She clearly understood that this question had nothing to do with her competence. It was CNN's offensive strategy to turn the discussion into a personal attack. But she was ready. She took a slow breath, looked at the reporter, and replied with a slight smile. "John, thanks for the question. But I wonder why, when Jen Psaki was White House press secretary, your network didn't ask questions like these? Or do you only care about experience when it comes to conservatives?" The hall froze for a second. Someone snorted quietly in surprise. But Karoline had no intention of stopping. "You say I have little experience. But I have held more press conferences than many of your colleagues have in their entire careers. I worked in the White House during the first Trump administration. I know how the media works. I know what they do." She clenched her fingers on the podium and added, "And most importantly, I know what they are hiding." The room freezes as Karoline begins her revelation. After these words, there was complete silence in the hall. The journalists realized that this would not be an ordinary press conference. Karoline didn't just respond, she took the initiative. John Raymond tried to object, but Karoline didn't give him a chance. She looked straight at him, making it clear. "Did you think you were going to put me in a corner? But now it is I who dictate the rules of the game." She was ready for the next attack. And she knew this was just the beginning. Because next round she will destroy him with facts. What happens next? How will Karoline expose CNN? What manipulations will she bring to light? And how will the public react to this public dressing down? A tense silence fell over the room. The journalists watched closely as Karoline Leavitt maintained her absolute composure. John Raymond, a well-known CNN reporter, decided he had found a soft spot in the young press secretary. He paused briefly to let everyone digest his question, then continued. I'll repeat. Do you really think you're worthy of this position? Or were you chosen only because you're easy to manipulate? Some members of the media chuckled, and some even tried to suppress a smile. The question was clearly provocative, and perhaps it would have worked on another person. But not on Karoline. She paused, deliberately letting the reporter feel the effect of his words. Then she slowly raised her head and spoke. John, when the previous press secretary, Jen Psaki, went to the press, you didn't ask her questions like that. You didn't question her competence, even though she had no experience in the White House press corps before joining the Biden administration. There were cheers in the room. The journalists knew that Karoline had not just dodged a blow, but had turned the situation to her advantage. It's clear that your question has nothing to do with any genuine concern about the press secretary's experience, she continued. Rather, it's an attempt to create a false impression of my qualifications. I worked in the White House since the first Trump administration. I know the system from the inside. I've interacted with the media, analyzed their work, and studied their approaches. She leaned a little closer to the microphone. And I understand perfectly well how such manipulations work. The room became quieter. John Raymond's expression changed slightly. He was used to attacking press secretaries, but few had fought back so quickly or so coolly. He had not expected to be found out so quickly. But backing down was not his style. Okay, he said, trying to regain control of the situation. Let's get to the point. The Trump administration claims that the press is biased against Republicans. But independent sources confirm that such accusations are baseless. Isn't that an attempt to undermine confidence in a free press? Karoline looked at him with a slight smile. Independent sources? You mean the same media that publish fake stories and refuse to admit their mistakes? Raymond frowned, but Leavitt didn't let him interrupt her. Let me remind you of one example. Your channel, CNN, claimed that Russia interfered in the 2016 election based on unconfirmed information. However, years later, even your own analysts admitted that there was no evidence. But did CNN apologize for the disinformation? No. A light hum went through the hall. Or another case. She continued. When your network published stories about how the Trump administration was allegedly endangering national security by distributing classified documents. But it later turned out that these were false accusations, and no evidence was presented. But did you correct your headlines? No. She paused, allowing the audience to absorb her words. So, John, when you talk about independent sources, you may be referring to media outlets that have long ceased to be independent and have become instruments of political struggle. Raymond pressed his lips together. He tried to change the subject. But if the press was wrong, why didn't the Trump administration correct those mistakes through transparency? Why is the White House so often accused of hiding information? Karoline nodded. Good question. But let's look at the situation more broadly. You talk about transparency. But let's figure out which media outlets are most likely to spread disinformation. She leaned forward. When evidence of corruption in the Biden family was published in 2020, the major media outlets remained silent. They called it disinformation, until years later they admitted it was true. Where was their transparency? Why did no one ask tough questions of the Democratic administration? Raymond opened his mouth, but Karoline had already moved on. Or another example. When Twitter and Facebook blocked news about Hunter Biden's laptop, calling it Russian propaganda, your network supported this decision. And what happened in the end? It all turned out to be true. Silence reigned in the hall. She waited a couple more seconds, then added, So when you talk about transparency, let's be honest. The Trump White House has always been the subject of harsh criticism from the media. However, when it comes to democracy, many journalists prefer not to ask uncomfortable questions. Journalists didn't know what to say. Even those with liberal views understood she was speaking in facts. Raymond was still trying to save face. So you think that criticism of the press is an attack on freedom of speech? Leavitt smiled. Freedom of speech is the right to speak the truth, not the right to lie without consequences. Some of the journalists looked at each other. It was a strong statement. She delivered the final blow. I respect real journalism. But I don't respect propaganda. And as long as I'm here, I won't allow the White House to become an arena for manipulation. Raymond didn't know what else to say. He opened his mouth, but then closed it. The audience was completely on Karoline's side. She didn't just respond to the attack, she nipped it in the bud. And everyone understood that this dispute was only gaining momentum. Silence reigned in the hall. The journalists froze, ready for another powerful blow from Karoline Leavitt. On the screen the press secretary used to display the facts, a headline from the CNN archive appeared. Donald Trump ordered police to disperse peaceful protesters for a photo op. Some journalists stirred, realizing what incident was being discussed. Leavitt paused, looked around the room, and continued. It was 2020. Your channel claimed that President Trump ordered police to use tear gas and disperse peaceful protesters to take a photo outside St. John's Church. She paused briefly and looked straight into John Raymond's eyes. However, a few months later, the Ministry of Justice officially admitted that this was not true. It was proven that the protesters were dispersed by decision of law enforcement agencies to ensure security, and this had nothing to do with the president. There were whispers in the room. Some journalists exchanged glances. John Raymond pretended to write something down in his notebook, but Karoline could clearly see his irritation. But what did your network do? She continued. It continued to spread this lie, knowing that the reality of events was different. CNN did not apologize, did not issue a retraction with the same vigor that it spread the fake news. She tapped the tablet screen and another CNN headline appeared in front of the reporters. Trump calls Nazis very fine people. Some in the room were already beginning to understand where Leavitt was heading. John, do you remember this incident well? She asked. Raymond crossed his arms over his chest but said nothing. Your channel took the phrase out of context and spread it as if the president was justifying neo-Nazis. However, if you play the full video of that speech, you can clearly hear that he condemned radicals on both sides and said, I condemn violence, hatred and racism in any form. She turned to the audience. But people didn't hear it. Because CNN and other liberal media outlets imposed their version. As a result, this lie was repeated for years. And none of your colleagues even tried to correct it. The whispers in the room grew louder. Some journalists began exchanging glances, and several even nodded in agreement with her words. Karoline looked back at Raymond. Tell me, John, how did it happen that your channel once again found itself at the center of a disinformation scandal? Was it an accident? Or a deliberate policy? He narrowed his eyes but did not answer. She nodded as if confirming her thoughts. Okay. Let's talk about something else. The slide on the screen changed to show the CNN headline. Hunter Biden's laptop is Russian disinformation. Everyone knew about this incident. John Raymond winced as if he felt uneasy. Let's remember what your channel said in 2020. Any news about Biden's son's laptop was called unverified rumors, propaganda, a Kremlin development. This was repeated hundreds of times. The hosts of your programs ridiculed this topic, calling it a conspiracy theory. She pressed a button on the tablet. A new title has appeared. The New York Times confirms Hunter Biden laptop data is authentic. But 2 years later, even your allies at the New York Times admitted that all those files were real. Does that mean CNN was spreading fake news, John? He remained silent. Leavitt shrugged. You were part of a campaign to hide the truth. Your channel, along with other liberal media outlets, deliberately distorted the facts in order to influence the outcome of the election. Silence reigned in the hall again. Karoline exhaled slowly, then added calmly. So when you talk about independent sources, I suggest you be careful with this term. Because the last few years have shown that your journalism is not a search for truth, but an instrument of political pressure. The journalists froze. Some of them didn't even try to hide that they were impressed by her answers. Even those who came to the press conference with the intention of attacking the Trump administration knew they were witnessing something important today. John Raymond was silent. For the first time in a long time, he couldn't immediately come up with a caustic response. His face turned red and his fingers clenched nervously around his pen. Karoline Leavitt had just made CNN and the liberal media look bad, and there was nothing he could do about it. She turned her gaze to the rest of the journalists and added, "Freedom of speech is the right to tell the truth. But when the media starts to deliberately manipulate information and call it journalism, they betray their mission." She paused briefly and then put the tablet down and said, "Next question." The hall seemed to wake up from its stupor. Someone quickly began writing in a notebook, someone began talking with colleagues. A press conference that was planned to be an attack on Trump suddenly turned into a triumph for his press secretary. Everyone understood that today Karoline Leavitt proved that she was in the right place, and that even the most seasoned journalists will be afraid of her. Chapter 4: Reporter Loses Control. CNN's Public Humiliation. There was a tense silence in the hall. The journalists, who just a few minutes ago were waiting for the opportunity to drive the new press secretary into a corner, now sat in their chairs, barely holding back their whispers. Karoline Leavitt smashed all of CNN's manipulations to smithereens, backing up her words with facts and real examples. But the main blow was yet to come. John Raymond was not about to give up. He understood perfectly well that he was losing, but his pride did not allow him to retreat. The journalist gripped his pen tightly, tapped his fingers on the table, then looked up at Karoline. "Okay, so your analysis of some of the news stories is valid." His voice was hard, but there was a hint of irritation in it. "But you haven't answered the main question. If the Trump administration cares so much about the truth, why don't you allow independent investigations into the White House's actions?" Karoline raised an eyebrow, as if surprised by the naivety of his attempt to steer the discussion back onto a comfortable track. "Independent investigations?" she asked with a slight smile. "John, do you mean the same kind of independent investigations that your colleagues conducted into the Russian interference case, which turned out to be a fabrication?" The hall buzzed again. One of the journalists couldn't help but chuckle. Raymond winced but continued, "I'm talking about other investigations. For example, why doesn't the Trump administration disclose all the details of its decisions on domestic policy? Why doesn't the press have full access to meeting materials?" Karoline leaned back, folding her hands on the podium and looking at the reporter for a long moment. "John, now remind me how many closed meetings the Biden administration has held?" Raymond pursed his lips. "This is not. How many times has your channel demanded full transparency from Democrats when they were making their policies in offices without journalists? And how many times has CNN asked Jen Psaki or Karine Jean-Pierre these questions?" Quiet laughter erupted in the hall again. Karoline continued, "The answer is obvious. You only care about transparency when it comes to Republicans. But when a Democratic administration does the same thing, it suddenly ceases to be an issue." Raymond opened his mouth, but Leavitt again didn't give him a second. "Let's get this straight, John. I'm not against honest questions. But when some politicians have to follow the rules, while others get a free pass from the media, that's not called journalism, that's called political bias." Now no one in the room was whispering, everyone was looking only at Leavitt and Raymond. The journalist was losing control of the situation, and everyone saw it. Going on the offensive, Karoline turns it against CNN. Raymond realized that he had no more convincing arguments, so he decided to attack Leavitt personally. "You are young, you do not have much experience in public office. Do you not think that your confidence may be premature?" Karoline smiled. "John, it seems to me that experience is not only the number of years in the profession, but also the ability to analyze information, see manipulation, and not be afraid to tell the truth." She straightened up, her voice becoming a little firmer. "Now let's talk about your experience. You've been working in the media for over 10 years, but it seems you still haven't learned how to check your sources." The audience gasped again. Someone laughed quietly. Raymond blushed. "Your channel has published false stories dozens of times. And not because you lack data, but because the truth did not fit into your agenda." She paused, then added, "Maybe the problem is not in my experience, but in yours?" Now the entire audience was looking only at John. Some journalists kept their heads down, while others secretly recorded what was happening on their phones. Final blow: CNN journalist loses control. Raymond was on the verge of a breakdown. He quickly looked at the notebook, then suddenly raised his head and almost shouted, "You're just following Trump's line. You're justifying everything his administration does." But Karoline didn't flinch. She looked at him calmly, then turned her gaze to the rest of the journalists. "Let me remind everyone here of one simple thing. I am the White House press secretary. My job is to explain the administration's decisions. But do you know what the difference is between me and some of your colleagues?" She paused, then said, I'm sorry. I tell the truth even when it is inconvenient. And you only when it suits your interests." The hall exploded. Some of the journalists gasped, and someone tried to speak, but Karoline raised her hand. "And lastly, before anyone says again that journalists are just doing their job, let me clarify, your job is to find facts, not to create them." Raymond could no longer say anything. He knew he had lost. It was the worst press conference of his entire career. Karoline Leavitt triumphs as new White House leader. Karoline took a slow breath, looked around the room and said, "Next question." But this time no one was in a hurry to ask it. Even the bravest journalists realized that they had just witnessed the public humiliation of a CNN reporter. Leavitt didn't just stand her ground, she showed the entire country that she would no longer allow the media to play dirty games. The audience began to split. Some journalists looked at her with respect. Others with obvious irritation, realizing that now their favorite pressure tactics no longer work. But the outcome was obvious. Today, Karoline Leavitt won more than just an argument. She proved that her appointment was not an accident. And now no one doubted, before them was a new heavyweight of American politics. The room was tense after the stunning showdown between Karoline Leavitt and John Raymond. Journalists accustomed to seeing White House press secretaries on the defensive knew they were witnessing something different. Not only had Karoline exposed CNN's manipulation, but she had also called into question the liberal media system that had dictated the agenda for years. Raymond, who had been trying to look confident just a few minutes ago, was now unable to hide his confusion. He flipped through the pages of his notebook, hoping to find his final trump card in the notes, but his thoughts were in disarray. Each of his attempts to attack Karoline ended with her convincing arguments and exposure of fakes. All he could do was pretend that he was in control, but even his colleagues knew that he was not. Karoline turned her gaze to the room and said calmly, "I think today's press conference gave us a lot of food for thought. We talked about how journalism should work and how it shouldn't work. We looked at specific examples of disinformation, bias, and manipulation. Now I want to ask you, dear members of the press, a question." She paused, allowing the audience to fully focus on her words. Why is it that when one politician makes a mistake it becomes the main topic of news for weeks, but when another does the same, the press prefers to remain silent? Why is it that when Republicans demand transparency it is called undermining democracy, but when Democrats withhold information from the public it is considered necessary measures? No one dared to respond. The journalists who had recently attacked Leavitt now looked more like listeners at a lecture, being given a harsh but truthful lesson. Do you want to be trusted? Then work honestly. Be journalists, not activists. Stop using double standards. If you really believe in an independent press, be independent all the time, not just when it suits your political position. In the back row, one of the journalists cleared his throat nervously. Others continued to write down her every word, realizing that today they had witnessed a historic event. Raymond, who still hoped that he could seize the initiative, tried to make one last attempt. You can criticize the media as much as you want, but it doesn't change the fact that the Trump administration remains one of the most controversial in history. You can blame the press, but that doesn't change the real problems that exist in the country. Karoline looked at him with a slight smile. You are right, there are problems. But there are always problems, in any administration. The question is why some of them are covered 24 hours a day, while others are ignored. Why did the media talk about Trump's phone call for months, but remain silent about the Biden family's foreign financial deals? Why does every move by the Republicans turn into a scandal, while the Democrats' corruption schemes fade into the shadows? Raymond opened his mouth, but realized he had nothing to say. There was silence in the room. It was the moment when it became clear to everyone Karoline Leavitt was more than just a press secretary. She was a new, powerful voice to be reckoned with. She hadn't just withstood the pressure of the liberal media, she had turned the tables, making them feel like they were being interrogated themselves. One of the journalists timidly raised his hand. Do you have a forecast for whether the press's attitude towards Republicans will change? Karoline shook her head. I have no illusions. Let's be honest, objectivity in the media was lost a long time ago. The press has become an instrument of political struggle. But there is one thing I know for sure: we will no longer allow the truth to be manipulated with impunity. If someone spreads lies, we will expose them. If someone tries to distort the facts, we will show evidence. She turned her gaze to Raymond. And today it has become clear that some people no longer have a monopoly on the truth. Raymond looked away. Karoline straightened up, looked at the audience, and said calmly, without unnecessary emotion, That's all for today. Thank you for your time. She turned around and walked out of the room. Some journalists were still sitting there in complete stupor. Some continued to take notes, some talked to colleagues. But everyone understood, today something more had happened than just a press conference. It was the moment when the balance of power began to shift. When the media monopoly on interpreting reality began to crumble. When Karoline Leavitt didn't just defend the Trump administration, she questioned the very approach to political journalism that had been the norm for decades. An aide was waiting for her in the corridors of the White House. You did a great job, he said, handing her a folder with documents. Karoline smiled, took the folder, and replied calmly, This is just the beginning.